Okay, so today we're tackling one of the truly fascinating and dramatic tensions in all of legal history. We're talking about the ultimate clash, the state's massive power to prosecute crimes versus the absolute non-negotiable necessity of protecting your constitutional rights. We're going to see exactly how this delicate balance was forged, tested, and ultimately defined. And our main focus today? The absolute landmark 1967 case, Stonehill v. Diokno.
Let's just dive right into a profound, almost philosophical question that forms the very core of today's high-stakes legal drama. Think about this. If law enforcement agents, the actual people sworn to uphold the law, if they violate your constitutional rights to gather evidence against you, should the courts just look the other way and use it? Or should they throw it out completely to punish the police, even if it means a potentially guilty person walks away free? Keep that in the back of your mind, because it is the exact dilemma the Supreme Court had to grapple with here.
Which brings us to our first major chapter, the 42 warrant fishing expedition.
To really grasp how the courts answered that big question, we have to travel back to the inciting incident. It's 1962. There's this massive, highly coordinated government crackdown against a really prominent businessman named Harry S. Stonehill and his associates. The authorities suspected Stonehill of, various violations. And the sheer chaotic scale of their response was just staggering. 42. That is the number of simultaneous search warrants issued by different judges against Stonehill, his partners, and the ton of corporations they ran. Just imagine the scale of that government overreach. This wasn't some targeted investigation into a single specific crime. No way. This was an overwhelming show of force designed to basically sweep up absolutely everything in its path. And when I say everything, I mean literally everything. They were looking for books of accounts, financial records, vouchers, typewriters, even bobbins, which are just cigarette wrappers. And what exactly were Stonehill and his team accused of doing to justify a massive raid like this? Well, the applications for the warrants vaguely cited, and I quote, violation of central bank laws, Tariff and Customs Laws, Internal Revenue Code, and the Revised Penal Code. They essentially just listed entire massive volumes of law without pointing to a single specific illegal act. Crazy, right? Let's break down the anatomy of a general warrant. See, what the government executed that day wasn't a standard lawful search, not at all. They executed what's known in legal terms as a general warrant. This is a search warrant that completely fails to specify a determinate offense, and it totally fails to particularly describe the things to be seized. The Supreme Court took one look at those 42 warrants against Stonehill and realized they were exactly this. They basically allowed law enforcement to go on a massive fishing expedition through all of Stonehill's business transactions, legal or otherwise. The court boldly declared that issuing warrants for abstract, vague violations is straight-up legal heresy. It places the sanctity of your home, the privacy of your correspondence, entirely at the mercy of the whims and caprices of police officers. And that leads us to the monumental adoption of the exclusionary rule. So this set the stage for a seriously revolutionary choice. The Supreme Court had to figure out exactly what to do with the actual mountains of documents and evidence seized during this totally unconstitutional fishing expedition. Now, before Stonehill, the Philippines actually followed something called the Mancado Doctrine. This essentially said, hey, even if the constable blunders and seizes evidence illegally, we can still use it in court. The old idea was, you shouldn't let a criminal go free just because the police made a mistake. But in the Stonehill ruling, the Supreme Court completely and unanimously abandoned Mancado. Instead, they officially adopted the exclusionary rule. This rule is a total game changer. It states that illegally obtained evidence is completely, 100% inadmissible. Why? Because excluding the evidence is really the only practical, effective way to force law enforcement to actually respect constitutional guarantees. If the state can't profit from its illegal actions, they're going to be deterred from breaking the law in the future. Chief Justice Concepcion actually delivered this incredibly passionate, history-making opinion, heavily inspired by the U.S. Supreme Court case Matt v. Ohio, where he stated, "The ignoble shortcut to conviction left open to the state tends to destroy the entire system of constitutional restraints on which the liberties of the people rest." He basically framed the exclusionary rule as your ultimate personal shield against state lawlessness. It's this powerful promise that your rights aren't just empty words on a page, but actual enforceable boundaries that the state simply cannot cross. But wait, there's a catch. Let's talk about the corporate standing loophole.
You might be thinking, wow, what a sweeping victory for Stonehill. But as we know, the law is rarely that simple. A really complicated twist introduced this concept called legal standing. So the Supreme Court actually split the seized documents into two completely distinct groups. For the evidence seized directly from Stonehill's personal residences, the court ruled that his personal constitutional rights were directly invaded. Because of that, he had the legal standing to object, and boom, that evidence was suppressed. It could not be used against him. But, and here's the kicker, for the evidence seized from the corporate offices, the court ruled differently. They stated that corporations actually have a separate, distinct legal personality from their officers. So, because the corporations owned those offices and those documents, only the corporation's rights were violated by the illegal search, not Stonehill's personal rights, meaning Stonehill couldn't legally object to it, and that corporate evidence was actually admitted against him in his individual capacity. Now, not every justice agreed with this corporate loophole. Justice Castro wrote a fiercely worded dissenting opinion. He argued that all 42 warrants were intrinsically void from the start. As he eloquently put it, technical property distinctions, like whether you're a lessee, an invitee, or just the manager of a corporate office, are often of, quote, gossamer strength. They are just too flimsy to dictate whether someone receives actual constitutional protection. He firmly believed that if the search is illegal, the fruits of that search should be thrown out, absolutely regardless of the nuanced, complex property laws governing the specific building where the search happened.
Which brings us to our final core concept, the presumption of innocence.
So the Stonehill case really shows us how far the courts will go to restrain the state from breaking the law to gather evidence. But what happens when the state actually does follow all the rules? How heavy is the burden placed on the state to actually prove a crime? To explore this, let's briefly shift gears to our second case, People v. Dramayo. This case begins with a truly chilling timeline. First, a man named Estelito Nagaliza was scheduled to testify as a key witness in a robbery case. Second, the prime suspects in that robbery, Pablo Dramayo and Paterno Equibin, invited 5 other men for a drinking session where they hatched a pretty dark plot to ambush and silence Nagaliza. And finally, they executed their plan. Equibin struck the victim with a piece of wood, and Dramayo stabbed him repeatedly, resulting in his tragic death. This was the state's factual narrative, meticulously reconstructed from the evidence and witness testimony.
Now, 7 men in total were accused of participating in this conspiracy, but they met vastly different fates at trial. 2 of the men were actually utilized as state witnesses, meaning they testified for the prosecution in exchange for immunity. 3 of the men were completely acquitted because the state just couldn't prove their presence beyond a reasonable doubt. I mean, one of them even had a highly credible alibi that he was literally out fishing in the sea that night. So ultimately, only 2 men, Dramayo and Equibin, the masterminds, were convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Facing life in prison, Dramayo and Equibin's defense counsel presented a highly novel, honestly pretty ingenious argument on appeal. They essentially asked the court, look, if 7 of us were charged with a conspiracy, and 5 of those people were not convicted due to a lack of evidence, doesn't that inherently create reasonable doubt for the remaining 2 of us? It's a fascinating logical puzzle, right? If the state's narrative was too weak to convict the whole group, shouldn't the presumption of innocence rescue the final 2? Well, the Supreme Court answered that ingenious defense with a powerful clarification on the burden of proof. The court explained that the law does not demand absolute certainty to convict someone. Why? Because absolute certainty is pretty much impossible in human affairs. What the law requires is moral certainty. The fact that the state failed to prove the guilt of the other 5 men absolutely did not erase the moral certainty of Dramayo and Equibin's guilt. That guilt was firmly established by highly credible direct evidence of their specific actions. The presumption of innocence is an incredibly strong shield, but it is overcome when the state meticulously fulfills its prime duty of proving guilt with moral certainty. And that really brings us full circle, from the unconstitutional fishing expeditions in the landmark Stonehill case to the rigorous demands of moral certainty in the Dramayo case. We clearly see the justice system constantly weighing the scales. So what is the big takeaway here? It's that the rules governing how evidence is gathered and exactly how guilt is proven are the very foundation of a free society. I want to leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought. As technology advances and crimes become increasingly complex, how do we perfectly balance the state's duty to catch criminals with its absolute obligation to protect our civil liberties? It's a question every single generation is going to have to answer for itself. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.